The last thing Janet March planned was freedom. Not the kind of people run toward movies, not loud, not reckless, not impulsive. Quiet freedom, the kind you build slowly after years of second-guessing yourself, after years of trying to fix something that refuses to be fixed, the kind that doesn't come with celebration, just a decision, a calm, final decision. By the summer of 1996, Janet wasn't reacting anymore. She was preparing. On the morning of August 16th, in Nashville, Tennessee, she was supposed to sit across from a divorce lawyer and begin the process of leaving her husband. Her mother was going to drive her. That detail matters, because it tells you this wasn't sudden. This wasn't chaos. This was planned, supported, real. She had waited for that morning. Not days, not weeks, years. Years of arguments that never really ended. Years of walking carefully, measuring words, managing moods, try to keep peace in a place that no longer felt peaceful. And finally, she was done. But that morning never came. Because sometime during the night before, inside the home she owned with her 2 young children asleep, just rooms away, Janet March disappeared. Not a trace of struggle left behind. No signs of a hurried exit. No call. No message. No goodbye. Just silence. And then, a story. A simple one at first. She left after an argument. That's what her husband said. But simple stories don't stay simple when they're not true. Because over the next few days, that explanation started to grow. She didn't just leave. She went on vacation. A planned trip. 12 days. She packed her things. Took cash. Left instructions behind. Walked away from her life without calling her mother. Without saying goodbye to her children. Without telling a single person who knew her. And for a moment, that story just hung there, unchallenged. Because when someone disappears without a trace, people want something to hold on to, even if it doesn't make sense. But Janet's family didn't believe it, not for a second, because they knew her. They knew how she loved her children. They knew how close she was to her parents. They knew the plans she had made for the very next morning, and none of it matched. Not the silence, not the disappearance, and definitely not the story. So, while everything around them was trying to settle into uncertainty, they refused to let it. They kept asking questions, keep pushing, kept looking at the details that didn't quite fit. And slowly, those details started to shift the story from a disappearance to something else, something darker, something hidden just beneath the surface of an ordinary night that was supposed to lead to a new beginning. But instead, it became the moment everything ended. This is the story of Janet March, a woman who was one day away from starting over, and the mystery of what happened before she ever got the chance. To understand what was taken, you had to step back, before the headlines, before the investigations, before her name became something people searched for. Back to when Janet wasn't a case. She was just Janet. Janet Levine grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, in a home that was steady, structured, and full of support. Her father, Larry Levine, was a respected attorney, the kind of man who built his life on discipline, logic, and long hours. Her mother, Carolyn, was different in energy, warm, attentive, deeply involved. Together, they created something that would define Janet for the rest of her life, a sense of safety, a sense that she was seen. And Janet carried that with her. But she didn't grow into someone loud or attention-seeking. She wasn't the kind of person who needed to dominate a room to be remembered. Instead, she created. Quietly, she illustrated children's books, not for recognition, but because she loved it. She painted, she imagined, she built small, gentle worlds where everything felt softer, simpler, safer than real life. And if you listen to how people describe her years later, there's a pattern. They don't talk about achievements first. They talk about how she felt being around. Janet made people feel comfortable, not judged, not overwhelmed, not like they had to perform, just calm. And in a world that often rewards the loudest voice in the room, that kind of presence stands out more than people realize. But the most important part of Janet's life, the part that anchored everything else, came later, when she became a mother. Sammy, and Seppi, two young children who would grow up with incomplete memories because the person who should have filled them was gone too soon. And by all accounts, Janet didn't just love her children. She centered her life around them. The routines, the care, the quiet, everyday moments that don't make headlines, but make a child feel secure. Those were hers. It's easy in stories like this to focus on the mystery, on what happened, on how it happened. But if you skip this part, if you skip who she was, you miss the weight of what was lost. Because Janet wasn't just someone who disappeared. She was a daughter raised in a home that believed in her. She was an artist who saw the world in softer colors. She was a mother who built her life around her children. And when she vanished, it wasn't just a person who was gone. It was stable. It was warm. It was the quiet presence that held a family together. That's the part that stays with people. Not just that she disappeared, but who disappeared and who was left behind to carry that absence. Because the story doesn't begin with the night she vanished. It begins much earlier, with a relationship that, from the outside, looked like it made perfect sense. When Janet met Perry March, it made sense, at least on paper. They met at the University of Michigan, a place where ambition is expected, where people are building futures long before they fully understand themselves. And Perry stood out. He was intelligent, sharply so, not just book smart, but the kind of person who knew he was smart. Confidence, articulate, driven. He carried himself like someone who already saw the life ahead of him and intended to get there. For someone like Janet, that kind of certainty can feel grounding. She was creative, introspective, and quietly expressive. He was structured, focused, forward-moving. From the outside, it looked balanced. Two different personalities fitting together in a way that made sense. And as their relationship moved forward, so did his career. Perry went into law. And this is where Janet's family became more deeply part of the story. Because they didn't just accept him, they invested in him. Her father, Larry Levine, was already established in the legal world, respected, connected, and he opened the doors. Not casually, but meaningfully. He helped support Perry through law school at Vanderbilt, gave him opportunities that most young lawyers spend years trying to access. Eventually, Perry joined Larry's firm, which, on the surface, looked like something more than support. It looked like trust, like inclusion, like he wasn't just marrying into the family. He was becoming part of it. And for a while, everything aligned. Career growth, family support. A stable home life is taking shape in Nashville. From the outside, it looked like a couple building something solid. But appearances can be convincing, even when they're incomplete. Because while things look structured and successful on the surface, dynamics were forming beneath the surface that didn't show up in public. Not clearly, not immediately, but gradually. There are relationships where both people grow together. And then there are relationships where one person begins to define the terms. Subtly at first, in conversations, in disagreements, in the way decisions are made or not made. People who knew Perry would later describe something consistent about him. He didn't like being challenged. He didn't respond well to losing in arguments, in situations, in anything that disrupted his sense of control. And early on, those traits can be easy to overlook. They can look confident, like intensity, like ambition. But over time, those same traits can start to feel different. Less like leadership, more like pressure. And for Janet, someone who was naturally gentle, naturally accommodating, that shift didn't happen loudly. It happened quietly, in moments, in patterns, in the gradual realization that something about the relationship was becoming harder to navigate. Still, from the outside, none of that was obvious. What people saw was a successful couple, a lawyer building his career, a supportive family behind them. A home is being built. Children are being raised. Everything that signals stability, everything that says this works. But sometimes, the most complicated relationships are the ones that look the most functional from a distance, because what's happening inside them doesn't announce itself. It builds, slowly, quietly, until one day, It can't be ignored anymore. And for Janet, that moment was coming. Not all at once, but steadily. As the relationship she had stepped into, the one that once felt aligned, began to change into something else entirely. The shift wasn't sudden. It rarely is. There's a moment in some relationships that's hard to identify while you're living inside it. When things stop feeling equal, but haven't yet become obviously broken. No single argument you can point to. No single event that explains everything. Just a gradual change in how it feels to exist there. For Janet, that change unfolded over time. What had once looked like a partnership became harder to navigate, harder to predict, harder to live inside. Years later, when court records and testimony began to surface, they painted a clearer picture of what had been happening behind closed doors. Not a single incident, but patterns of emotional control, patterns of verbal conflict, and allegations of physical abuse. And that distinction matters, because patterns don't announce themselves. They repeat, they build, they become normal, until you step outside them. Emotional control doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's quieter than that. It shows up in how conversations end, who gets the final say, in how disagreements are resolved or not resolved at all. It shows up in the lingering tension, in the sense that you're constantly adjusting yourself to avoid setting something off. The verbal conflict becomes part of the environment, not occasional, but frequent, predictable, where arguments don't lead to understanding. They lead to exhaustion. And over time, that kind of environment changes a person. Not all at once, but gradually. Janet didn't ignore it. She tried to fix it. She pushed for therapy, not as a last resort, but as a solution, a way to stabilize what was slipping. She encouraged psychiatric help. They went to counseling. An effort was made, consistent effort. From Janet's position, this was still a marriage, still something worth saving, especially with children involved. But there's a limit to what effort can do, because therapy can help with communication. It can help with understanding. It can even help repair certain kinds of damage. But it doesn't work when the underlying issue isn't a misunderstanding. And in this case, that's what the situation began to reveal. This wasn't just conflict. It wasn't just stress. It wasn't just two people struggling to connect. It was about control. Control over conversations. Control over decisions. Control over the relationship's direction. And more importantly, control over Janet. And here's what made that dynamic more volatile than it might appear at first glance. Janet wasn't dependent. The home they lived in was in her name, not shared, not jointly owned. Hers. The land the house sat on, also hers. Funded through her own resources, her own financial foundation. That changes everything. Because in many situations where control exists, it's reinforced by dependency, financial, emotional, structural. Leaving becomes complicated, sometimes impossible. But for Janet, leaving was possible, legally, practically, financially. If she chose to walk away, she could. And that reality introduces a different kind of tension. Because when control exists in a relationship, the possibility of losing it can become the most destabilizing factor of all. From the outside, none of this was fully visible. There were no constant public scenes, no obvious collapse that everyone could point to. What people saw instead was a functioning household, two professionals, children are being raised, a life that still looked intact. But inside that structure, the pressure was building. Janet was adjusting, trying, managing, but also changing. Because there comes a point in situations like this where effort turns into realization, where trying to fix something slowly becomes understanding that it may not be fixable. And that moment, when it arrives, is quiet, but it's decisive. For Janet, that moment was getting closer, not as a reaction, not in anger, but in clarity. The kind of clarity that leads to decisions, plans, steps forward. Because once you recognize that something isn't working, the next question becomes unavoidable. What do you do about it? And for Janet, the answer was beginning to take shape. Pause here, just for a moment, because this is where the story changes. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but in a way that matters more than anything that's come before it. Up to this point, everything has been building in one direction: tension, conflict, patterns, pressure that doesn't quite have a release. The kind of pressure people live with for years, convincing themselves it's temporary, manageable, fixable. And Janet tried. She adjusted. She pushed for help. She stayed inside something that was getting harder to hold together. But somewhere along the way, something shifted. Not in the relationship, in her. Because there comes a moment in situations like this that doesn't look dramatic from the outside. There's no announcement, no confrontation that changes everything overnight. It's quieter than that. It's the moment where I'm trying turns into understanding, where effort slowly gives way to clarity. And once that clarity settles in, it doesn't go away. Janet wasn't reacting anymore. She wasn't trying to manage every situation, or fix every argument, or hold something together that was already coming apart. She was thinking ahead, thinking about what life would look like outside of what she was living in, thinking about her children, about stability, about peace, about what it would mean to stop enduring and start choosing. And that kind of shift is powerful because it doesn't come from impulse. It comes from time, from experience, from reaching a point where staying the same feels harder than changing everything. That's where Janet was. Not in chaos, not in confusion, but in the decision, a quiet, steady decision that would shape everything that came next. Because once someone reaches that point, they don't usually go backward. They move forward, carefully, deliberately, step by step. And that's exactly what Janet began to do. She started planning. By the summer of 1996, the marriage had reached a point where it could no longer hold itself together. The arguments weren't occasional anymore. They were frequent, predictable, the kind that doesn't resolve anything. They repeat with slightly different words, but the same outcome. Distance had grown between them, not just emotional distance, physical distance too. Perry had started staying in hotels instead of coming home, sometimes for days at a time, which, on the surface, can look like space, like someone trying to cool off. But over time, it starts to feel like something else. Disconnection, avoidance, a life beginning to split into separate parts. And while all of that was happening inside the marriage, pressure was building outside of it as well. There were professional issues, financial strain, legal complications connected to his work, situations that brought stress, scrutiny, and instability. And pressure, when it builds in multiple areas at once, doesn't stay contained. It spills into conversations, into decisions, into relationships that are already fragile. So, by this point, what Janet was living inside wasn't just a difficult marriage. It was a situation under strain from every direction. And this is where her earlier clarity turned into action. Because once someone reaches that point, where staying feels heavier than leaving, the next step is planning. Not dramatic planning, not reckless, careful, intentional. Janet made a decision, a quiet one, but a final one. She scheduled a meeting with a divorce lawyer. August 16th, 1996. That date matters because it turns everything we've talked about so far into something concrete. This wasn't just a thought anymore. It wasn't something she was considering. It was something she was doing. There was a time, a place. The next step is already in motion, and she wasn't doing it alone. Her mother, Carolyn, was going to drive her. That detail matters more than it might seem, because it tells you something important about Janet's state of mind. She wasn't isolated. She wasn't acting in secrecy or fear. She had support. She had someone beside her, literally, which means this decision wasn't built on impulse. It was built on certainty. It was structured, planned, grounded in reality. And when decisions reach that level, when they move from private thoughts to scheduled actions, they become harder to stop because they're no longer hypothetical. They're real, and that's where Janet was. One step away from changing her life. One morning away from beginning something new. After years of trying to hold something together, she was finally ready to let it go, to choose something different. For herself, for her children, But decisions like that, especially in situations where control has been part of the dynamic, don't exist in isolation. Because when one person decides to leave, the other person is forced to face something they may not be ready to accept. Loss of control, loss of structure, loss of life as it exists. And for some people, that moment is where everything becomes unpredictable. August 16th was supposed to be the beginning, but before that morning could arrive, there was one more night. August 15th, 1996. It's an ordinary night. At least, that's how it would have looked from the outside. A house on Blackberry Road in Nashville. 2 young children are inside. A couple whose marriage had been under strain for years. Nothing about that evening, on the surface, would have stood out, but this is the last night. Janet March is never seen alive. At some point that night, there is an argument. That much is not speculation. It's been acknowledged, and given everything we know about the state of the marriage, that, too, would not have been unusual. Arguments had become part of the pattern, part of the rhythm of the household. But this one would be the last. We don't have a recording of it. No transcript. No witness in the room. Just the knowledge that it happened, and that whatever followed it changed everything. Around midnight, a phone call is made. Janet's parents received it. On the other end of the line, they're told something simple, direct, almost casual. She left after the argument. Walked out. No panic in the explanation. No urgency. Just a statement. And in that moment, it's the only version of events they have. But even then, it doesn't quite sit right. Because Janet wasn't someone who just disappeared into the night. Not without a word. Not without reaching out. And especially not under these circumstances. Because just hours later, she was supposed to be somewhere specific. Sitting across from a divorce lawyer, with her mother beside her, taking the first formal step toward leaving her marriage. People don't plan something like that and then vanish without explanation the night before. They follow through. So even in those early hours, before any investigation had begun, there was already a quiet question forming. What really happened that night? But for a short time, that question didn't have space to grow, because the explanation didn't stay simple. It evolved. Over the next few days, the story began to expand, gain detail, structure. She didn't just leave after an argument. She went on vacation. Not a spontaneous trip, a planned one. 12 days. She had packed her things. Take cash. Brought her passport. She had even left behind a list. Instructions. Things to be handled while she was gone. On the surface, it starts to sound organized, intentional, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. But the more detailed the story became, the more it started to raise questions. Because details only help when they align with reality. And this story didn't. Janet was deeply connected to her children, to her parents, to her routine. She wasn't someone who would leave without telling her mother, especially when they had planned the very next morning. She wasn't someone who would walk away from her children without a word, no explanation, no goodbye. And if she had truly gone on a trip, there would be signs, activity, movement, something. But there wasn't. No phone calls, no confirmed sightings, no financial activity matched someone traveling. Just a story that kept getting more detailed, but not more believable. And the more it was repeated, the more it started to feel like something else. Not an explanation, but a construction. Something is being built, piece by piece, to fill a space where the truth should have been. Because when someone disappears, what matters isn't just what's said, it's what doesn't fit. And on the night of August 15th, almost nothing did. By the time the next morning came, the one Janet had been waiting for, she was already gone. 2 weeks had passed. 14 days. 2 weeks had passed since Janet March had not been seen. 2 weeks where every call, every visit, every attempt to reach her came back empty. It wasn't until that time had passed that she was officially reported missing. And that delay already raised questions. Why wasn't she reported sooner? What did the first days look like behind closed doors? And how could someone simply vanish in a city like Nashville without leaving a trace? Then the first physical evidence emerges, and with it, The first real cracks in the story. A witness comes forward. Not a sensational tip, just an observation. They had seen Perry march around 1 a.m. the night Janet disappeared. Walking, alone, with a bicycle, alone. It's an odd detail, and in the context of what was supposed to be a quiet, uneventful night, remarkable. Weeks later, the discovery that would shift the investigation arrives. Janet's car, abandoned, in that very same parking lot where the witness had seen Perry. Inside the car, her belongings, her passport, the things she had supposedly taken with her on a planned trip untouched. It didn't add up. Everything she was supposed to have packed, everything she was supposed to need for a getaway, sitting there, inert, and suddenly, the planned disappearance narrative began to collapse. Investigators started to peel back the story, layer by layer. Questions surface. If she left voluntarily, why would she leave her car with all her essentials? Why did she not contact her family? Even a quick message to say she was safe. Why the long silence before she was reported missing? Every small detail starts pointing in one direction. Something didn't happen the way anyone was told. And in these early days, before anything else is confirmed, the tension begins to mount, not in loud shocks, but in the quiet impossibility of it all. An empty car, untouched belongings. A witness placed Perry near that location hours after she was last seen. These cracks would eventually widen, but in this first phase, they simply exist. They demand attention, and they begin to quietly, inexorably rewrite the story of what happened that night. Back at the March home, investigators begin to notice things that don't sit right. It's the kind of place that should feel familiar, normal, safe. Yet, in the wake of Janet's disappearance, everything seems off. The first detail that stands out is cleaning. Not the kind of tidying that happens on a Tuesday afternoon, or the weekly dusting before the housekeeper arrives. This was early cleaning, deliberate and thorough. Floors polished, counters cleared, rooms ordered. As if someone wanted the house to look untouched by what had just happened, or as if they wanted to remove any trace of it. Then there's the rug. A large, dark rug that had been rolled up that morning. A witness later recalls seeing it rolled and waiting, and notices Janet's young child playing on top of it, balancing, climbing, oblivious to the tension in the air. It's an image that's almost ordinary, almost benign, except it isn't. By the end of the day, the rug is gone, vanished. No one explains where it went. No one recovers it. It's as if it had never been there at all. And when you start to look at these details together, the early cleaning, the rolled rug, the missing item, they carry a weight beyond what anyone first realizes. It's not just about a house. It's about the trace of a life suddenly erased. Investigators would later return to that scene multiple times, combing through floorboards, cabinets, and closets. Every corner, every shadow examined. And yet, some things remain unaccounted for, like the rug. Small details, yes. But in a case where a person has vanished, small details are often the most telling. The house becomes a silent witness. Rooms empty, belongings in place. Yet a careful observer knows the order is deliberate, not natural. Even the child's interaction with the rolled rug, playful, innocent, creates a contrast that is almost unbearable in hindsight. Normal life continuing against the backdrop of disappearance. And in these walls, in these corners, the story starts to shift again. From disappearance to something more deliberate. From uncertainty to intentional action. The house itself becomes part of the investigation. A puzzle waiting to be read. Because now, the story changes its rhythm. Up until this point, we've been following Janet's disappearance like a thread pulled tight. An absence, a question, a void. But here, something shifts. The narrative is no longer about chaos. It's about patterns. Investigators begin to notice the way small details line up. The rolled rug, the early cleaning, the untouched belongings in the car. Each one alone could be a coincidence. 2 weeks, 3 weeks into the search, and suddenly, coincidence begins to feel like design. This is the emotional pivot. For the family, it's gut-wrenching. Fear transforms into suspicion, confusion into dread. For the investigators, it's a different kind of clarity. Disjointed events now form a map, leading toward the central figure who could explain it all. And for the audience, This is the moment to reset emotionally. We move from shock to focus. Because the case, as it will become clear, is no longer just about a woman missing. It's about intentional action. The void left by Janet isn't empty. It's patterned. And those patterns are what guide the investigation forward. Investigators were facing a puzzle that most homicide detectives dread. Nobody. No physical confirmation of death. No clear crime scene. Just absence and suspicion. But what they did have was pattern, and patterns can speak louder than a single witness. They began to assemble the timeline, minute by minute, detail by detail. Tires were replaced shortly after Janet vanished. Why? On their own, new tires are mundane maintenance, maybe even a coincidence. But within the context of a sudden disappearance, it looked deliberate. A vehicle prepared to move something or someone quietly. Disinfectant detected in a vehicle. Harmless in a garage? Sure. But combined with other activities? It suggested someone was trying to erase traces. A computer hard drive was removed and destroyed. Not immediately suspicious in the digital age. But when paired with other anomalies, investigators began to see an effort to hide evidence. Legal consultation before Janet was reported missing. This detail was subtle, but telling. Someone was already thinking ahead, weighing consequences, and seeking guidance before the alarm had even been raised. Step by step, the investigators were outlining. It wasn't clean, it wasn't obvious, but the dots connected in ways that couldn't be ignored. And then came the most damning collapse of the narrative. The story Janet supposedly left behind, the vacation, the planned trip, the carefully laid instructions, did not hold up. No credit card use. No sightings by friends, co-workers, or family. No communication from Janet herself. Nothing. Every claimed sign of life evaporated under scrutiny. This is the emotional pivot of the investigation. It is no longer a disappearance. It becomes a crime of calculation, carried out in plain sight, hidden in the ordinary. Investigators began to speak in probabilities, in sequences, in behavioral consistency. Alone, each act could be rationalized. Together, they told a story no one could ignore. A story where control, timing, and planning were central. Where the missing woman's voice had been erased from the narrative. And where those left behind, the children, the family, the friends, had to start facing a horrifying possibility. Janet would not come back. This part sets the stage for the first major court-related revelations and the chilling realization that a body isn't required for a case. But a body can still be central to the emotional weight of narrative. As the investigation slowly gained traction, one thing became clear. Janet's disappearance wasn't just a criminal puzzle. It was a personal battle. Her parents, Larry and Carolyn Levine, refused to be sidelined. They weren't passive observers of a missing person case. They were relentless advocates, and sometimes the friction they created became as critical as the clues themselves. From the earliest days, they challenged law enforcement. When progress felt slow or non-existent, they pressed for answers. When legal avenues seemed blocked, they pursued them with determination. They didn't just grieve quietly. They acted. Every court filing, every lawyer consulted, every procedural challenge was part of a strategy to ensure Janet's absence could not erase her existence. And there was another layer to their fight. The children, Sammy and Tsipi, so young, so vulnerable, were suddenly caught in the middle. Larry and Carolyn demanded access. They pushed against court decisions that might have kept the children isolated from the side of the family that knew Janet best. They were not just fighting for justice. They were fighting for connection, for continuity, for memory. This relentless advocacy had ripple effects. It kept public attention alive. It forced investigators to stay focused. It created pressure that would eventually influence legal proceedings. And even when doors seemed closed, Larry and Carolyn found ways to chip away at silence, to demand accountability, to make sure no one, including the courts, could treat Janet's disappearance as a private, contained tragedy. This part of the story is as much about emotional resilience as it is about evidence, because sometimes in cases without a body, the family becomes the engine of truth. Their persistence laid the groundwork for what was coming next. Investigative breakthroughs that would finally connect patterns of behavior to a larger, undeniable reality. Years had passed since Janet March vanished. Months turned into seasons. Seasons turned into years. The public attention faded. The media cycles moved on, and the case risked slipping into the slow churn of unresolved disappearances. But investigators never stopped looking. And eventually, the breakthrough came not from the street or a chance forensic discovery, but from within the family itself. People close to Perry began to speak. Slowly, carefully, hesitantly. Their testimonies weren't cinematic confessions. They were fragments, small admissions, pieces of behavior that, when stitched together, formed a pattern that investigators had suspected all along. They spoke of destroyed evidence. Tires were replaced shortly after the disappearance. Hard drives removed and wiped clean. Disinfectant used in a vehicle. They described actions that hinted at premeditation. Objects moved. Rooms cleaned meticulously. Items are disappearing from the home without explanation. And they shared details about remains being handled, conversations, and behaviors that, until that moment, had existed only in conjecture. It was not a complete picture. Investigators still didn't have a body, still didn't have every answer. But the puzzle started to fit together. Suddenly, what seemed like coincidences, missing passports, untouched belongings, early house cleaning, now lined up in a sequence that pointed to one unavoidable conclusion. Janet had not left voluntarily. For law enforcement, this was a tipping point. They now had enough corroborated behavior, enough admissions, and enough evidence of concealment to take the next step. They could begin building a legal case that wasn't just based on suspicion. It was based on pattern, intent, and alignment with previously unexplainable events. Emotionally, it was also significant. For Janet's family, this breakthrough validated years of persistence. Every legal challenge, every court filing, every push for attention had been worth it. They had been right. They had not imagined the inconsistencies. And now, the facts were finally catching up to reality. The breakthrough didn't close a chapter. It opened a new one. It was the point where the narrative of disappearance became a narrative of deliberate action, where investigators could start to piece together what happened to Janet March. And for the audience, it's here that the tension escalates. The slow, meticulous work of uncovering truth, layer by layer, begins to collide with the hard reality of what was concealed for so long. The challenge of a bodiless murder case. Nobody, no physical remains, no forensic certainty of death. That's the scenario prosecutors faced in the Janet March case. From a legal standpoint, this is one of the hardest types of cases to win. How do you prove someone is dead? How do you prove that someone else caused it? Without a corpse, every claim must be supported by layers of evidence, patterns, and human testimony. The defense immediately seizes on this. If you can't show she's dead, you can't prove a murder. It's a logical argument, and jurors hear it. It's simple, elegant, convincing, but the prosecution doesn't rely on simplicity. They rely on accumulation, a mosaic of evidence, behavioral analysis, and circumstantial proof. Building the case, layer by layer, one behavior. The prosecution meticulously paints a picture of Perry March's conduct before and after Janet's disappearance. Last-minute changes in his routine. Misdirection about Janet's whereabouts. Reports of cleaning, hiding, and altering evidence in ways that align with a planned disappearance. Each action seems small in isolation, but together they form a pattern. Control, concealment, calculation. 2. Timeline. Investigators and attorneys reconstructed Janet's final days and hours. Discrepancies in Perry's statements about where he was. Witness accounts placing him near Janet's car late at night. A puzzling sequence of phone calls, trips, and meetings that don't align with someone who is missing voluntarily. The timeline becomes a silent witness. It tells a story of opportunity, planning, and intent. 3. Inconsistencies. Perry's explanations shift over time. First, Janet left voluntarily. Then, she went to a friend's house. Later, she supposedly went on a trip. The prosecution highlights these contradictions, showing how the narrative changes to fit the absence of evidence rather than the presence of fact. The jury's role. The jury sits in silence. They are tasked not just with hearing facts, but connecting the dots themselves. Every testimony, every timeline gap, every odd behavior. The prosecutors know jurors naturally ask, does this add up? They structure presentation so the dots, though each circumstantial, start to form a cohesive story. It's not about proving one thing beyond doubt. It's about proving a pattern beyond a reasonable doubt. Strategic evidence without a body. Prosecutors bring attention to what's missing. Janet's passport and personal items remain behind. Her car, cleaned and left in the parking lot, is found months later. Disappearances of objects that could provide evidence, like rugs, cleaning materials, and electronic records. Each gap is itself evidence. Each inconsistency builds a narrative that Janet could not have disappeared voluntarily. Human elements, witnesses, and testimony. Family members describe Janet's plans, her nature, and her habits. Their testimony underscores the unlikelihood she would vanish on her own. Neighbors and colleagues offer small observations, strange movements, odd hours, or sudden behavior changes. Expert witnesses, behavioral analysts explain patterns of coercion and concealment. Together, these voices create a composite reality, one that the jury can emotionally and logically follow. Psychological tension. In the courtroom, the trial is more than facts. It's suspenseful. Every day brings new revelations, each one subtle but cumulative. Jurors are drawn into the gap between what is seen and what is missing. This is the psychological power of a trial without a body. The absence becomes a presence. Silence becomes testimony. What is not there forces interpretation. The audience of your documentary feels this tension as well, mirroring the jury's experience. Waiting, piecing together, imagining, verdict building without closure. By the time closing arguments arrive, the prosecution story is complete. Not with a corpse, but with proof through pattern, motive, and opportunity. The defense can challenge individual pieces, but cannot explain the entire mosaic of evidence. The jury does not see a body, but they see a man who controlled, concealed, and lied. They see actions that consistently point to one outcome: Janet March's death. In cases like this, the conviction comes not from a single irrefutable fact, but from the weight of 1,000 small truths forming one undeniable story. Emotional reset, jurors and audience. At this point, the audience and the jury are on edge. No physical closure exists. No visual confirmation. Yet, by understanding the patterns in human behavior, they grasp the reality of loss and accountability. This is where emotion and intellect converge, and why a bodiless murder trial is not only legally challenging, but narratively compelling. Conviction and legal accountability. Finally, after years of investigation, legal battles, and painstaking reconstruction of events, justice in the courtroom arrives. Perry March is convicted, first for the murder of Janet March, and later for conspiracy to commit murder against her parents, Larry and Carolyn Levine. The sentences: 32 years for the murder, plus 24 consecutive years for conspiracy, totaling 56 years behind bars. From a legal standpoint, the system worked. Accountability was delivered. But here the audience, and more importantly, Janet's family, faces a stark reality. Legal resolution does not equal closure. The haunting absence. Janet's body was never recovered. There are no remains to bury, no grave to visit, no physical evidence to touch or memorialize. For her parents, every anniversary, every holiday, every ordinary day is punctuated by this absence. Larry and Carolyn Levine spent years holding their grief quietly, while simultaneously fighting to keep their daughter's story alive in the courts, in the media, and in public consciousness. The loss of Janet is not abstract. It is tangible in her children's eyes, in the empty spaces of a house once filled with her presence. This absence, this invisible wound, shapes every interaction, every decision. Even after Perry is convicted, the Levine struggle is far from over. The decades-long civil and criminal legal battles show the persistence and resilience of a grieving family navigating a system that often feels indifferent. From Tennessee to Illinois and even Mexico, Larry and Carolyn fought for custody of their grandchildren, attempting to protect them from a man who had already taken their mother. They pursued every legal avenue to honor Janet's memory, to enforce accountability, and to ensure that her story could not be rewritten or forgotten. Their effort transforms tragedy into actionable advocacy. Mark Levine, their son, becomes a vocal advocate for domestic violence awareness and custody law reforms, ensuring that the lessons of Janet's case ripple far beyond their own personal loss. The conviction brings legal clarity, but psychologically, The impact is complex. For the children, Sammy and Zeepy grew up without their mother, in the shadow of legal wrangling, far from the place she loved, never able to ask her questions, hear her voice, or feel her guidance. They carry the trauma of both loss and displacement, raised by the man who caused the loss, under the ongoing scrutiny of extended family. For the grandparents, Larry and Carolyn's grief is compounded by decades of legal maneuvering and threats, including a chilling conspiracy orchestrated by Perry from jail. Their court victory is a bitter one. Justice exists in theory, but the absence of Janet remains a daily reality. For the community, the case serves as a stark reminder of how domestic violence can escalate to fatal outcomes. Neighbors, friends, and investigators are left grappling with the question, could it have been prevented? Legacy and broader impact. Janet's disappearance and Perry March's conviction ripple far beyond the courtroom. Legal precedent. The case demonstrates that murder convictions can be achieved without a body, through the careful accumulation of circumstantial evidence and witness testimony. It becomes a reference point in legal circles for how to prosecute cases of domestic homicide, where direct physical evidence is lacking. Awareness of domestic violence. The story brings national attention to patterns of abuse, coercive control, and the lethal risk posed during periods of separation. It sparks conversations about early warning signs, intervention, and the systemic support needed for victims attempting to escape abusive relationships. Cultural memory. Janet March's story is remembered not just for its crime, but for her humanity, her creativity, devotion to her children, and the courage she exhibited in attempting to reclaim her life. The absence of her body makes her memory more haunting, but also more poignant, because every recounting emphasizes what was lost, not just what was taken. Even with conviction, even with restitution, the void remains. Every legal victory is accompanied by the silence of Janet's absence, the home she once filled, the laughter of her children when she isn't there, the rituals of life that continue, always with one seat empty. Her story becomes a meditation on the limits of legal justice, on how accountability can exist without restoration, and how love, memory, and grief coexist in spaces left unfilled. This absence, the missing pieces, the unanswered questions, is the haunting heartbeat of the case. And yet, even decades later, Janet's story continues to unfold. How will her children process a life without their mother? How does society continue to learn from her story? And are there still lessons hidden in the gaps, in the spaces between evidence and memory, that could save someone else? The conviction is over. The trial is done. But the impact of Janet March's disappearance and the courage of her family echoes far beyond the courtroom, leaving a story that refuses to quietly end. Janet March was never just a name in a police report. She was never just a missing person statistic, a set of circumstantial clues, or the center of a trial. She was a mother whose laughter once filled a home now marked by absence. She was a daughter, cherished and celebrated, whose parents' lives were forever reshaped by the night she vanished. She was a woman of quiet artistry, of imagination and gentleness, the kind of person whose presence left soft, enduring impressions. Her life was full of small, meaningful acts, painting illustrations for children, creating moments of beauty in the ordinary, caring for her kids, nurturing her family. Friends remember her warmth, her laughter, her creativity, the ways she could make a room feel lighter simply by being there. In the end, those were the threads that made her irreplaceable. On the morning of August 16, 1996, Janet was meant to take control of her life, to claim the independence she had long fought for. She was ready to move forward, legally, emotionally, practically. She had made her plans. She had her mother by her side. She had hoped for a future beyond fear, beyond control, beyond a marriage that had grown dark and dangerous. And then, that story was ripped away from her. Yet, even in her absence, Janet March's life continues to resonate to the actions of those who loved her. Larry and Carolyn Levine, her parents, spent years navigating courtrooms across states and borders, refusing to let her memory fade. Every appeal, every civil suit, every public retelling was a declaration. Her life mattered. Her story mattered. And they would not let it be rewritten by someone who sought only to erase it. Her children, Sammy and Zeepy, carry her in ways that no trial or sentence could ever fully quantify. her love, her influence, her presence endures in them. The quiet, invisible inheritance of a mother whose absence is palpable, but whose impact is permanent. Janet March may never be physically restored to the world she left behind, but she is remembered in the courage of her family, in the awareness her story brings to the dangers of domestic abuse, and in the lives she touched quietly and profoundly during her 2 short years. Her story was taken, yes, but it is not erased. It lives on in memory, in advocacy, in lessons learned, and in the hearts of those who refuse to allow the darkness of that night to define her life. The camera lingers, not on crime, not on conviction, not on statistics, but on Janet herself, on the mother who loved, the daughter who inspired, the woman who created beauty in the quietest of ways. And as the screen fades, the final thought remains. Janet March's life was stolen, but her legacy is unstoppable. Her story, her truth, remains alive. Even now, decades later, the world still asks the same haunting question. Where is Janet March? Her body was never recovered. Her final resting place remains a mystery, buried somewhere, perhaps forever, beyond the reach of certainty. Every investigation, every trial, every courtroom victory or setback has revealed pieces of the story, but the ultimate truth, the final location, remains elusive. For her parents, her children, and those who knew her, this absence is a wound that never fully heals. It is a question that lingers in quiet moments, in family photographs, in empty chairs at the table, in the spaces where her laughter once lived. The world may have seen a conviction, a sentence, a measure of justice, but justice alone cannot answer a question that echoes through decades. Where is Janet? Investigators, journalists, and amateur sleuths alike have scoured records, retraced paths, and followed leads. Clues have been examined, rumors debated, possible sightings dismissed, but nothing has brought Janet home. Every new theory opens doors to possibilities, but the reality remains the same. Her disappearance is unresolved, and so this story, it doesn't truly end here. Not yet, because as long as that question remains, as long as Janet March's final chapter is unwritten, the case, the search, and the memory of the woman she was would continue. This is more than a story of crime and conviction. It is a story of absence, of love, of memory, and of hope. And it is a story that refuses to close, quietly insisting that Janet herself has the final word. Somewhere, somehow, waiting to be found. The screen fades to black, leaving the audience with the impossible, unrelenting question. Where is Janet March? And for now, we are left to wonder. Absolutely. Let's focus deeply on Janet March's family, their grief, resilience, and the long-lasting impact on her children, and write it in a way that fits your documentary-style narrative. I'll make it layered, emotionally immersive, and grounded in documented facts. Janet March's disappearance was more than a crime. It was a rupture that fractured an entire family. Her parents, Larry and Carolyn Levine, were left in a void that no court ruling or news story could ever fill. From the moment Janet vanished, they were forced into a relentless cycle of hope and despair, navigating the labyrinth of legal systems, chasing leads, and confronting the horrifying possibility that their daughter had been taken from them forever. For the Levines, the initial days were a haze, calls unanswered, no sightings, no confirmation. Their daughter, a woman they had raised, nurtured, and supported, was gone, and with her disappearance came a gnawing uncertainty, an unrelenting question. Had she run away, or had something unimaginable happened? The answer, tragically, became clear over time, but the weight of the unknown shaped the next decade of their lives. They were not passive observers in the story. They became relentless advocates, forcing law enforcement to investigate when Janet's absence might have otherwise been minimized. Every phone call, every court filing, every piece of evidence was a small battle in a war to recover not just justice, but connection. Janet left behind 2 young children, Sammy and Zeepy, ages 5 and 2, the very heart of her life. Their mother's disappearance created an unimaginable upheaval. Overnight, their sense of safety, love, and routine was shattered. They were separated from grandparents who had cared for them and relocated across state lines, and eventually to Mexico with their father, the man responsible for their mother's death. For a child, the loss of a parent is destabilizing under any circumstance. For Sammy and Zeepy, it was compounded by confusion, betrayal, and displacement. Their father, who should have been their protector, became the architect of their trauma. Meanwhile, their grandparents fought tirelessly to maintain contact, to instill a sense of continuity in family, and to preserve the memory of their mother. Every custody hearing, every legal maneuver became a high-stakes negotiation for love, safety, and memory. The Levines' advocacy was not abstract. It was intensely personal. They sought to shield their grandchildren from the darkest truths, while simultaneously confronting a criminal system that was slow, complex, and international in scope. They became intermediaries, negotiators, investigators, and surrogate parents, all while navigating the deepest grief imaginable. The emotional toll on Janet's family cannot be overstated. Every day without Janet was a day of absence, a day of unanswered questions, a day in which hope battled despair. Yet, what emerges most clearly from the Levine story is resilience. They channeled grief into action. They became persistent, formidable advocates for justice, for their daughter and for their grandchildren. Her brother, Mark Levine, took up the mantle publicly, connecting the family's decade-long struggle to broader issues of domestic violence and custody law. Their story became not only a personal fight, but a catalyst for awareness and reform. The Levines' grief became fuel, transforming private pain into public advocacy, ensuring that Janet's life and her murder would not be forgotten. Even as courts reversed judgments, as Perry March manipulated jurisdiction and legal technicalities, the Levines refused to relent. Their fight was not just legal. It was moral, emotional, and unyielding. Every setback deepened their commitment. Every small victory became a beacon in the long shadow of loss. Janet March's children, though uprooted and traumatized, grew with the knowledge of their mother's courage, creativity, and devotion. They carried the fragments of her life forward, held tightly in the arms of grandparents who refused to let the story vanish. For the Levines, the mission was never only to punish the perpetrator. It was to preserve Janet's legacy, to protect the children, and to ensure that, even in her absence, Janet remained present in their lives. Her story is a testament not just to the tragedy of violent loss, but to the extraordinary strength of family, the bonds that survived even the darkest acts, and the relentless pursuit of justice in the face of absence. Even now, decades later, Janet March's absence is felt, not just in a missing person case file, but in the lives of the children she loved, the family who fought for her, and the community that refuses to forget. Her story reminds us of the fragility of life, the dangers that can hide behind closed doors, and the courage it takes to pursue justice when the world seems indifferent. If Janet's story has stayed with you, if the twists, the relentless pursuit of truth, and the heartbreak of loss resonate, there are countless more cases just waiting to be uncovered. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and join us as we dive into chilling, true crime stories where the evidence is thin, the suspects seem untouchable, but the truth eventually emerges. Because the next story might be closer than you think.